My husband James died on a rainy Tuesday in October, and by that Friday I had $340 in a checking account, 2 kids asleep down the hall, and a mortgage payment I had no idea how I was going to carry alone. Then, 4 weeks after the funeral, a stranger deposited $8,000 into that same account. No note, no name. It happened again the next month, and the month after that. It kept happening, every single month, for 10 years. I never found out who was sending it until the morning a lawyer called and said, "Ma'am, a woman named Eleanor Voss passed away last week. Your husband saved her life 20 years ago, and she never forgot it. She has left you $68 million. But there is one condition. Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. People always say that grief rearranges you completely, that it takes the person you were and leaves someone unrecognizable standing in their place. I used to think that was an exaggeration, something people said to sound poetic at funerals. I don't think that anymore. Grief didn't just rearrange me. It also, though I couldn't have known it at the time, revealed a version of my husband I had never fully met, a man who had been quietly carrying a debt of gratitude so large it would eventually reshape my children's entire future. But that comes later. First, you have to understand who we were before any of it started. My name is Claire Bennett, and for 9 years I was married to James Bennett. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom rental in Aurora, Colorado, a suburb east of Denver where the mountains are a smudge of blue on the horizon if you catch the light right, and where most of our neighbors worked in healthcare or logistics, or the airport just down the road. I was a supply chain analyst for a mid-sized distribution company, the kind of job where you spend your days reading manifests, tracking inventory flow, and learning to notice the exact moment a system starts to strain under pressure before it actually breaks. James was a paramedic. He'd been one for 15 years by the time he died, running calls out of a station near Fitzsimons, the kind of work that ages a person quietly from the inside, calcifying itself into the lines around their eyes. We weren't wealthy. We weren't the couple people pointed to at dinner parties. We were the couple who split grocery bills down to the receipt and argued gently about whether the kids needed new soccer cleats or whether last year's would hold for one more season. But we were happy, or at least I believe we were, in the particular unglamorous way that happens when 2 tired people build a life together out of 12-hour shifts and packed lunches and Sunday morning pancakes. We'd met the way a lot of Denver couples seem to meet, at a mutual friend's barbecue in a backyard that smelled like charcoal and cut grass, and James had made me laugh so hard within the first 10 minutes that I spilled lemonade down the front of my shirt and had to borrow a jacket from a stranger for the rest of the afternoon. He proposed 18 months later on a hiking trail near Estes Park, badly, nervously, dropping the ring box in the dirt before he ever got the question out, and I said yes before he even finished asking, because I already knew. He was the kind of man who noticed when you were quietly tired and brought you coffee without being asked, who could fall asleep within 90 seconds of his head hitting a pillow no matter what he'd seen on shift that day, who read Owen the same 3 picture books so many times he had them memorized and still never skipped a page. He was not a man I thought had secrets. That, I think, was the whole point of him. If I'm honest with myself now, though, there were small things. Threads I noticed, and then, the way you do when you love someone, folded neatly away instead of pulling on. About 18 months before he died, James started taking a phone call on the 2nd Tuesday of every month. Always the same day, always outside, always with the garage door half open and his voice pitched low enough that I couldn't make out the words. When I asked, he said it was an old friend from his first years on the job, somebody going through a hard time who liked to check in. I believed him because there was no reason not to. James was not a secretive man. He forgot to hide birthday presents. He couldn't keep a poker face to save his life. There was also, every few months, an envelope, plain, white, unmarked, that appeared in the drawer of his nightstand and then disappeared again within a week or two. Once I asked him about it, half joking, and he said it was mileage reimbursement from a side shift he picked up for a private ambulance company. I didn't examine it too closely. We needed the extra income, and I was grateful for it without asking too many questions about where exactly it came from. Looking back, I understand now that this is precisely how good, ordinary secrets survive inside a marriage. Not because anyone is lying maliciously, but because both people have quietly agreed, without ever discussing it, not to look too hard at the things that don't quite add up. And then there was a name, Eleanor. James mentioned her maybe 4 or 5 times over the years, always briefly, always the same way. An old family friend, someone from before we met, someone he checked in on. When I pictured her at all, a retired schoolteacher, perhaps, or a widowed neighbor from his childhood in Wyoming. I never asked for a last name. There are 1,000 small omissions like that in every marriage, and I had no reason, none at all, to think this one mattered. He died on an ordinary Tuesday. He'd worked a double shift and was driving home a little after midnight down a stretch of Colfax that had been slicked over by an early October rain. A pickup truck ran a red light. The paramedic who had spent 15 years arriving first at other people's worst moments never had a chance to see his own coming. He was 36 years old. I got the call at 1:14 in the morning, and I remember every single detail of it with a clarity that grief specialists later told me was normal, even though nothing about it has ever felt normal to me. I won't describe the funeral in detail. I don't think I could, even now, not fully. I remember that the fire station and the ambulance company sent a full honor guard, that Doug Marino carried one corner of the flag with hands that shook the entire time, that Owen stood next to me in a blazer 2 sizes too big, trying so hard to be brave that it broke something in me to watch him do it, and that Maya, only 4, kept asking in a small voice when Daddy was coming home from work, not yet old enough to understand that some shifts never end. I remember a line of paramedics and firefighters stretching out the door of the funeral home, people I had never met, telling me quietly that James had trained them, had covered their shifts, had once driven 40 minutes on his day off to help a rookie through a bad call. I didn't fully understand, that day, how many lives one quiet, unassuming man could touch without ever once mentioning it at home. What I will say is that by the time the last casserole dish had been returned and the last sympathy card had gone quiet in my mailbox, the real crisis had already begun to reveal itself, the one that doesn't show up in an obituary. James and I had never carried life insurance beyond the minimum policy through his employer, the kind that pays out just enough to cover a funeral and not much else. We had a mortgage with 9 years left on it. We had 2 children, Owen, who was 7, and Maya, who was 4, with all the ordinary, relentless expenses that come with keeping 2 small humans clothed, fed, and reasonably content. And I had, in the fog of those first weeks, missed enough work that I was quietly, politely informed my position was being restructured. Restructured was the word they used. I understood it to mean what it meant. By the second week of November, I was doing the kind of arithmetic that keeps a person awake at 3 in the morning with a calculator app open on their phone. Rent, groceries, daycare for Maya, the used minivan payment, the electric bill that always ran high in a Colorado winter. I had roughly $340 in checking and a savings account that held slightly less than that. I remember sitting at our kitchen table one night after the kids were asleep, staring at the numbers on my laptop screen, feeling the particular vertigo of watching a structure you trusted quietly reveal that it had never really been sound to begin with. I want to be honest about what that period actually felt like, because I think people romanticize grief when they haven't lived inside it. It wasn't cinematic. It wasn't tears in the rain. It was mostly just exhaustion, layered over more exhaustion, punctuated by moments of sharp, disorienting fear about money that had nothing poetic in them at all. I applied for 3 jobs a day. I sold James's motorcycle, the one he'd owned since before we met, for less than it was worth because I needed the cash faster than a proper sale would have taken. I started keeping the thermostat at 62 and telling the kids we were playing a game called Camping Inside. I sold my wedding ring's matching band, the delicate one I never wore because it caught on everything, and told myself it didn't count as giving anything up, not really, because I still had the ring that mattered. I remember standing in the cereal aisle at the grocery store one evening, doing math in my head about whether we could afford the brand name box or needed the store version again, and having to step into the bathroom afterward because I didn't want Owen to see me cry over something as small and as enormous as cereal. Then, on the 4th of December, a deposit appeared in our joint checking account. $8,000, transferred from an account I didn't recognize, routed through something called a Cascade Trust Services entity that meant nothing to me. There was no note attached, no explanation, nothing but a routing number and a timestamp. I remember staring at my banking app for a long time, genuinely wondering if it was some kind of clerical error, or worse, some kind of scam that would reverse itself in a week and leave me even further underwater than before. I called the bank. The deposit was legitimate, they told me, wired from a trust account, fully cleared, mine to use. I asked who had sent it. The representative on the phone, not unkindly, told me she wasn't able to disclose the originating account holder's information without a subpoena or the account holder's own consent. I sat in my car in the parking lot of Maya's daycare for 20 minutes after that call, engine running for the heat, trying to decide whether to be afraid or grateful, and landing, in the end, somewhere I couldn't quite name. I paid the mortgage that was 2 weeks overdue. I paid the electric bill. I bought both kids winter coats that actually fit, and I told myself I would figure out the source of the money later, once the immediate emergency had passed. It happened again in January and February. $8,000, same routing structure, same lack of explanation, arriving with a quiet, almost eerie regularity, like a tide that had decided to come in on our behalf. By spring, I had allowed myself to stop questioning it quite so intensely, not because the mystery didn't matter, but because I was afraid that pulling too hard on the thread might make it stop, and I could not, in good conscience, risk that for my children's sake. I told myself I would look into it properly once we were stable. I told myself that for almost a decade. I want to be honest with you about something else, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. There is a particular kind of guilt that comes with receiving money you don't understand, especially when you desperately need it. I felt it constantly in those early years. A low hum underneath the relief, a suspicion that I was benefiting from something I hadn't earned and didn't have the full right to accept. I asked James's old partner at the ambulance station, a broad, kind man named Doug Marino, if he knew anything about an Eleanor that James used to mention. Doug thought about it for a long moment and said the name sounded familiar from years back, something about a house fire out near Golden, but he couldn't place the details. I filed that away, the way you file away most things during the years you're simply trying to survive. The next 10 years move the way years move when you are raising children largely on your own while also quietly rebuilding a life. I found new work, eventually, as a logistics coordinator for a regional hospital network, work that let me use the exact same pattern-reading instincts I'd always had, the ability to look at a system straining under pressure and see precisely where it would break if nothing changed. Owen grew from a solemn 7-year-old who missed his father with a silence that worried his teachers into a thoughtful teenager who eventually decided he wanted to study emergency medicine the way James had, though I never once suggested it to him. Maya, who barely remembered her father's voice, grew into a fierce, funny 10-year-old, and then an even fiercer teenager who kept a photograph of James on her nightstand and talked to it sometimes, in the unself-conscious way small children do before the world teaches them to feel embarrassed about grief. And every month, without fail, For 120 consecutive months, $8,000 arrived from the same unexplained source. I used it carefully. I paid off the mortgage 7 years early. I built a real emergency fund for the first time in my adult life. I paid for Owen's SAT tutoring and Maya's braces, and when the transmission on the minivan finally gave out for good, a reliable used sedan that didn't leave us stranded at daycare pickup. I never spent it carelessly, because some quiet, superstitious part of me still believed that treating it too casually might be the thing that made it disappear. The call came on a Wednesday morning in late September, almost exactly 10 years after James's death, while I was standing in my kitchen pouring coffee before an early shift. The number wasn't one I recognized, a Seattle area code, and I almost let it go to voicemail the way I do with most unfamiliar numbers now. Something made me answer. The man on the other end introduced himself as Walter Hines, an estate attorney calling from a firm in Seattle. He asked to confirm he was speaking with Claire Bennett, widow of James Bennett, formerly of Golden, Colorado. My stomach dropped in the particular way it does when a stranger already seems to know more about your life than you've told them. He said he was calling regarding the estate of a woman named Eleanor Voss, who had passed away 3 weeks earlier at the age of 81. I set my coffee cup down very carefully on the counter. I told him the name sounded familiar, though I couldn't place exactly why. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, gently, the way people speak when they know they're about to reorganize someone's understanding of their own life. Mrs. Bennett, 20 years ago, your late husband pulled Eleanor Voss out of a burning house on Lookout Mountain Road outside Golden, Colorado. She was unconscious. The fire crew hadn't arrived yet. He went in without turning gear, without backup, because he happened to be the first responder on scene from an ambulance that was passing by on an unrelated call. She never forgot it. For the last 20 years, she has been quietly supporting your family as a private expression of that debt. And now, under the terms of her estate, she has left you and your children the bulk of her fortune, $68 million. There is, however, one condition attached. I sat down on my kitchen floor. I want to tell you that's a figure of speech, but it isn't. My legs simply stopped holding me, and I found myself sitting on the cold tile with the phone pressed against my ear, listening to a stranger explain that the woman my husband had never fully told me about had spent 2 decades quietly making sure my children never went hungry, and had now, in her death, decided to hand us more money than I could have imagined in 100 lifetimes of careful budgeting. Walter Hines explained the condition carefully, in the measured, patient tone of a man who had clearly delivered enormous, disorienting news to grieving people before and had learned to pace it accordingly. Eleanor had structured her estate through an irrevocable trust years earlier, one that had already been quietly funding our monthly payments through a small allocated account. The remainder of her fortune, the investment holdings, the real estate, the proceeds from a technology company her late husband had founded decades before, had been consolidated into that same trust, with a provision naming James Bennett, or his surviving spouse and children in the event of his death, as the primary beneficiaries. The condition was straightforward on its face. I would need to appear in person at the Trust's offices in Seattle within 60 days of formal notification, bring documentation proving my identity and my marriage to James, and submit to a formal verification process before the funds could be released. Eleanor, Walter explained, had insisted on the in-person requirement herself, specifically because she did not want her generosity exploited by anyone claiming a connection to James that wasn't genuine. She had wanted to make it deliberately inconvenient for a fraud and deliberately simple for the real Claire Bennett. There's a complication, Walter said, his voice shifting into something more careful. Eleanor has a son, Nathaniel Voss. He was estranged from his mother for the better part of 15 years, and he has already retained counsel to contest the trust's provisions. I would strongly encourage you to retain your own attorney before you do anything else. I sat on that kitchen floor for a long time after the call ended, coffee going cold on the counter above me, and I did something I hadn't done in 10 years. I let myself cry, not from grief exactly, though grief was tangled up in it, but from the strange, disorienting vertigo of understanding that my husband had been a far larger, more complicated man than the tired, gentle paramedic I'd fallen asleep next to for 9 years. He had run into a burning house. He had never told me. He had let a woman he saved quietly carry our family for a decade after his death, and he had never lived to see any of what that debt would eventually become. I called out of work that day. I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, the way I imagine I'd learned to do from years of building supply chains out of chaos, and I started making a list, because making lists is the only way I have ever known how to survive being afraid. First, I needed to understand exactly who Eleanor Voss had been, and what, precisely, my legal standing was regarding a trust one hadn't known existed until that morning. Second, I needed an attorney of my own, not an estate attorney yet, but someone who could help me understand what an estranged, hostile son contesting a $68 million trust might actually attempt to do to stop it. Third, and this felt strange even writing it down, I needed to find out more about the fire on Lookout Mountain Road, because some instinct told me that understanding what James had actually done that night mattered more than I currently realized. I called Naomi Kessler that afternoon. Naomi was an estate and trust litigation attorney I'd met years earlier through the hospital network's legal department, back when I'd needed help untangling a minor dispute over James's original life insurance policy. We weren't close friends, but she'd been kind and thorough, and I still had her direct number saved in my phone under a note that simply said, "Good lawyer, remembers everything." I texted her that afternoon. "Naomi, I know this is out of nowhere, but I need a consultation as soon as you can manage. It's about James, and it's serious." She called me back within the hour. "Come in tomorrow morning," she said. "First thing. And Claire, bring anything you have. Bank statements, old messages, anything with James's handwriting on it if you've got it. Don't leave anything out, even if it seems small." Naomi's office was on the 16th floor of a glass building downtown, with a view that on a clear day stretched all the way to the foothills. I arrived the next morning having barely slept, carrying a manila folder with 10 years of bank statements documenting the mysterious deposits, a printout of my call with Walter Hines that I'd typed up from memory the night before while it was still fresh, and, tucked at the bottom, one of James's old EMS certification renewal folders that still had his handwriting scrawled in the margins. I don't know why I brought that last one. It felt important to have something of him with me while I tried to understand who he'd actually been. Naomi listened to the entire story without interrupting once, the way good attorneys learn to do, taking notes on a legal pad in handwriting so small and precise it looked almost typed. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me steadily. "Okay," she said. "Let's take this in order. First, the deposits you've already received over the past 10 years. Those are almost certainly gifts under the original trust terms, already legally yours, already taxed correctly if Eleanor's people were competent, which given the scale of this estate, I'd bet they were. Nathaniel can't touch those retroactively. That money is safe regardless of what happens next. Second," she continued, "the $68 million provision. This is where it gets more complicated. If Nathaniel is contesting the trust, his most likely argument is going to be one of two things. Either that his mother lacked testamentary capacity when she amended the trust to include you and your children, meaning he'll argue she wasn't of sound mind, or that James's original act of heroism doesn't constitute the kind of relationship the law recognizes as justifying the scale of bequest, and that undue influence was somehow exerted on Eleanor in her final years. Given that you've never even met this woman, Claire, that second argument is going to be difficult for him to make stick, but I promise you he's going to try. Third," she said, and her voice sharpened slightly, "you need to go to Seattle within that 60-day window, and you need to do it with an attorney present, and you need to document absolutely everything between now and then. If Nathaniel Voss's team reaches out to you directly, do not speak with them without me. Do not sign anything. Do not agree to any kind of informal conversation, however friendly it seems. People like this, people fighting to keep money they feel entitled to, do not fight fair, and they especially do not fight fair against a grieving widow who they assume doesn't know how to protect herself. I asked her the question that had been sitting underneath everything since the phone call. Do you think James knew this was coming? Do you think he knew Eleanor was planning something this big? Naomi considered that for a long moment. Honestly, she said, I doubt it. 20 years ago, he was a young paramedic who did something extraordinarily brave and then, from everything you've described, never spoke of it again. I think Eleanor Voss carried that debt far longer and far more seriously than James ever imagined she would. I think this was entirely her decision, made and remade over 2 decades, and your husband likely died never fully understanding the scale of what his one night of courage had set in motion. I left Naomi's office with a folder of intake paperwork, a retainer agreement, and a list of things to do before I flew to Seattle. The autumn light outside was sharp and clean the way it gets in Colorado in late September, and I sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time before I trusted myself to drive, turning over the strange, new shape of my husband's life in my mind, the way you turn over a stone to find something living underneath it you never expected. That evening, once the kids were asleep, I did what I imagine anyone in my position would eventually do. I searched Eleanor Voss's name. What I found painted the outline of a woman I wished, fiercely and uselessly, that I could have thanked in person. Eleanor had been the widow of Richard Voss, a software engineer who had founded a modest data infrastructure company in the 80s that had, decades later, been acquired for an amount that made the Voss family quietly, extraordinarily wealthy. Richard had died of cancer nearly 25 years earlier. Eleanor, by most accounts, had withdrawn from public life afterward, living alone in a large house outside Golden, Colorado, for years before eventually relocating to Seattle to be nearer to the trust attorneys who managed her late husband's holdings. There was one archived local news article, barely 3 paragraphs long, from a Golden community newsletter dated the same October as the fire James had mentioned only once or twice. A house fire on Lookout Mountain Road had been contained without loss of life. The article read, thanks to the quick action of an off-duty area paramedic who happened to be passing the scene. The homeowner, described only as a 61-year-old widow, had been transported to St. Anthony Hospital and was expected to make a full recovery. The paramedic was not named. I sat with that article open on my laptop for a long time, tracing the outline of a night I had never known about, a version of my husband running into smoke and heat without hesitation, for a stranger, for no reason except that it was who he was. I thought about the second Tuesday of every month, the phone calls he took in the garage with the door half open. I thought about the envelopes in his nightstand drawer. I understood, finally, that they had likely never been about mileage reimbursement at all. I think Eleanor called him once a month for years, simply to check in, and I think James, in his quiet, deflecting way, had decided that some kindnesses are better left unexplained, even to the person you love most. The next morning, before my appointment with Naomi, I drove out to the Golden Fire Station nearest Lookout Mountain Road on a hunch I couldn't quite justify to myself. The captain on duty, a heavy-set, silver-haired man named Ray Delgado who'd been with the department for almost 30 years, recognized James's name the moment I said it, and his whole posture softened. "Bennett," he said, "I remember that night. I was a rookie back then, still on probation, and by the time our engine got up that hill the smoke had already rolled halfway down the driveway. There was a paramedic ambulance already stopped at the curb, lights going, and this off-duty guy comes walking out of the front door carrying a woman like she weighed nothing, no turnout gear, just his uniform shirt pulled up over his mouth. Ray shook his head slowly. We tried to get his name for the incident report, and he brushed it off, said it wasn't a big deal, said any of us would have done the same thing. We all knew that wasn't really true. Not everybody goes in like that without gear on. He stayed with her on the lawn until the ambulance crew got her stabilized, and then he just left. Didn't even wait around for anybody to say thank you. Ray offered to pull the old incident report from the archive, and though most of the details had long since faded into routine paperwork, one line near the bottom, handwritten by whoever had processed the call that night, stopped me completely. Patient reports paramedics stated only, "Everybody deserves somebody who shows up." I sat in my car in the fire station parking lot afterward for a long while, turning that single sentence over and over, understanding for the first time that it might have explained more about who James was than 9 years of marriage ever fully had. The following week, Nathaniel Voss's attorney sent a formal letter to Naomi's office, and things changed considerably in tone. The letter, 3 pages of dense legal language, formally contested the trust's amended beneficiary provisions and requested a delay of the 60-day verification window pending discovery. Attached to it, almost as an afterthought, was a settlement proposal. Nathaniel would agree not to further contest the estate distribution if I accepted a one-time payment of $2 million, a fraction, Naomi pointed out flatly, of what the trust already legally provided for. In exchange for signing away any further claim to the estate and agreeing to a confidentiality provision preventing me from discussing the trust, Eleanor Voss, or the circumstances of the bequest with any third party, publicly or privately, for the rest of my life. "He wants to buy your silence," Naomi said when she called to walk me through it. "And more than that, Claire, I think he's afraid of something specific. This isn't the offer of a man who simply resents his mother's generosity toward a stranger's family. This is the offer of a man trying to make an inconvenient truth disappear quickly and quietly." We declined the offer without a counterproposal, exactly the way Naomi advised, a decision that communicated, she told me, that we weren't interested in negotiating a smaller piece of something we already had every legal right to in full. The phone call came 4 days later, on a Saturday evening while I was making dinner for the kids. An unfamiliar number, a man's voice, pleasant and unhurried in a way that felt deliberately, carefully calibrated. He introduced himself only as someone who worked closely with the Voss family and said he wanted to offer me, out of courtesy, some friendly advice. People who pursue contested inheritances, he said, sometimes find that scrutiny cuts in more than one direction. He mentioned, almost casually, that background checks on beneficiaries were standard practice in cases like this, and that sometimes those checks turned up things, old debts, minor legal issues, questions about a person's fitness as a parent that could complicate matters considerably if they became part of a public court record. It would be a shame, he said, for a grieving mother to have her whole life picked apart in a courtroom over money that had, after all, come from someone she'd never even met. I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear and my younger daughter setting the table 12 feet away, humming to herself, entirely unaware that a stranger was quietly threatening her mother's life apart on a Saturday evening. I told the man, in a voice that came out steadier than I expected, that I was recording the call and that I would be forwarding it to my attorney within the hour. There was a brief, telling silence before the line went dead. I called Naomi immediately. She listened to the recording twice. "This is good," she said, in the particular tone of a lawyer who has just been handed exactly the kind of mistake she was hoping the other side would make. "This is a documented attempt at intimidation made against a represented party in an active estate matter. I'm filing a motion first thing Monday morning." The visit came the following Tuesday, and it wasn't Nathaniel himself. It was a woman named Patricia Alvarez, who identified herself as Eleanor's longtime personal assistant and, more carefully, as someone who had known both Eleanor and, at a distance, the general shape of what had happened with James all those years ago. She called ahead, asked politely if she could stop by, and arrived carrying a small tin of shortbread cookies that felt, in hindsight, almost theatrically harmless, a carefully chosen prop meant to project warmth before a single word had been spoken. She sat in my living room and told me, in a soft, practiced voice how much she'd admired Eleanor, how devoted Eleanor had been to honoring James's memory, and how painful it was to watch the family fracture over money in the aftermath of her death. "Nathaniel isn't a bad man," she said. "He's frightened. He spent years estranged from his mother, and now he has to watch her fortune go to a family he's never even met, while he's left with almost nothing. Can you understand how that might feel to him?" "I can understand grief," I said carefully. "I understand it better than most people ever will. But I didn't ask for this money, and my husband didn't save Eleanor's life expecting anything in return. If Nathaniel has a relationship with his mother's estate to grieve, that's a conversation he needed to have with her while she was alive." Patricia's expression shifted, subtly but unmistakably, the warmth receding like a tide going out. "Nathaniel has asked me to make you an offer," she said, her voice cooler now, more precise. "He's prepared to settle for $5 million, structured as a lump sum, with a non-disclosure agreement covering all details of the trust and its origins. It's a generous offer, considering how easily this could become a very public, very ugly legal fight that drags your children's names through years of litigation." I looked at her for a long moment, thinking of Naomi's warning not to speak without her present, and then deciding, in that particular moment, that I needed to say this myself. "Patricia," I said, "please tell Nathaniel the answer is no. Tell him it was always going to be no. And tell him that if anyone else contacts me, my attorney, my employer, or my children's school again, will be filing additional motions before the week is out." She left without the pleasantries she'd arrived with, the tin of cookies still sitting untouched on my coffee table. I sat in my living room afterward and noticed, distantly, that my hands were shaking, not quite from fear, but from the particular physical aftermath of holding your composure through something that wanted very badly to unsettle you. I called my closest friend, Priya Nair, later that night. Priya and I had worked together at my old distribution company years earlier, before I'd moved to the hospital network, and she was the kind of friend who didn't need context to show up. She simply showed up, usually with wine for herself and sparkling water for me, and sat at my kitchen table while I explained the increasingly surreal shape of the past 2 weeks. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning her glass slowly on the table. "So James saved this woman's life, and then never told you the full story, and now his silence turned into $68 million, and this woman's son wants to threaten you into giving most of it back." Priya said it plainly, the way she said most things, cutting straight through the noise to the shape of the thing underneath. I nodded. "She's precise. That's what happened." Priya reached across the table and took my hand. "What do you need from me?" "I might need a witness eventually," I told her. "Someone who can attest to the timeline, to what I've been dealing with if it comes to that." "Done," she said, without a second's hesitation. "Whatever you need, Claire." "I mean it." Discovery moved quickly once Naomi's motion regarding the intimidation call was granted. Nathaniel's own financial records, subpoenaed as part of the broader trust dispute, revealed something that reframed the entire fight in a matter of days. Nathaniel Voss, it turned out, had been managing a portion of his mother's investment accounts for nearly 6 years under a limited power of attorney she'd granted him during a brief period of reconciliation. During that time, records showed a pattern of transfers from Eleanor's accounts into a business Nathaniel had quietly started, transfers that were never fully disclosed to Eleanor's primary trust attorneys, and that, by conservative estimate, totaled just under $4 million. When Eleanor had discovered the discrepancy 18 months before her death, she had revoked his power of attorney entirely, and, according to her private correspondence with Walter Heinz's firm, that discovery had directly accelerated her decision to finalize the provisions naming James's family as primary beneficiaries. Nathaniel wasn't contesting the trust out of grief over a stranger receiving his mother's fortune. He was contesting it because a public court battle risked exposing exactly how he'd spent the years leading up to her death quietly siphoning money from a woman who had trusted him. The very lawsuit he'd filed to stop us threatened, with each new piece of discovery, to unravel the story he'd built for himself. The deposition took place in late November, in a conference room at Walter Heinz's firm in Seattle, the city gray and rain-washed outside the tall windows in a way that reminded me, oddly, of the night James had died. Nathaniel sat across the table from me for the first time, a composed, silver-templed man in an expensive suit who had clearly been coached extensively on how to hold his expression steady. For the first 40 minutes, his answers were careful, rehearsed, full of I don't recall, and I'd have to check my records. Then Naomi placed a single printed page on the table between us, sliding it across without a word. It was an email recovered from Nathaniel's business account, sent to his own attorney 8 months before Eleanor's death, in which he had written, in language far less careful than anything he'd said under oath, that he needed to find a way to get ahead of whatever his mother was planning for the Bennetts before it became irreversible. "Mr. Voss," Naomi said, "do you recognize this email?" Nathaniel looked at it for a long moment, something shifting almost imperceptibly in his posture, the composed mask settling like a structure that has just lost a load-bearing wall. "I may have written that," he said finally. "Were you aware, prior to your mother's death, that she intended to leave the majority of her estate to Claire Bennett and her children?" Another long silence, for seconds, 5. I had some understanding that this was a possibility, yes. "And is it true," Naomi continued, her voice even and unhurried, "that between the years of 2019 and shortly before your mother's death, you transferred funds from accounts under her limited power of attorney into a business entity you controlled, without her full knowledge or consent?" Nathaniel's attorney leaned in and murmured something in his ear. Nathaniel said, quietly, that he would decline to answer further questions on the advice of counsel. Naomi wasn't finished. She placed a second document on the table, a spreadsheet Walter Heinz's forensic accountant had assembled from 6 years of account statements, individual transfers highlighted in yellow, each one traced to the business entity Nathaniel controlled. "Mr. Voss," she said, "can you explain why, on March 3rd of that year, $140,000 moved from your mother's brokerage account into an account held by Voss Capital Partners, an entity for which you are the sole listed officer?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "That was a loan," he said. "My mother was aware of it. Was there a promissory note?" A silence. "Was there any written documentation of this loan, Mr. Voss?" "I don't recall one being drafted at the time," he said finally, his voice noticeably smaller than it had been 40 minutes earlier. Naomi let that answer sit in the room for a long moment before she continued, moving methodically through 4 more transfers. Each met with the same shrinking, evasive answers, each one chipping further away at the composed man who had walked in that morning certain he held the stronger position. By the time she finished, Stewart, Nathaniel's own attorney, had stopped objecting almost entirely, and I understood, watching the two of them exchange a brief, unreadable glance, that whatever confidence Nathaniel had walked in with had entirely evaporated somewhere between the first transfer and the 5th. I watched him in that moment and understood, finally, what Naomi had told me weeks earlier, that this had never really been a fight about whether James's family deserved Eleanor's gratitude. It had been, from the very beginning, a fight about whether Nathaniel could keep a much smaller, much more damaging secret from ever coming to light. He looked at me once, briefly, across the conference table, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and then looked away. Nathaniel's attorneys reached out to Naomi 11 days later with a full withdrawal of the contest, an agreement to release the trust provisions in their entirety, and in exchange for Naomi agreeing not to formally report the power of attorney discrepancies to the state's Adult Protective Services Division, a signed acknowledgement that he would never again attempt to contact me, my children, or anyone connected to the trust. Naomi negotiated hard on that last point, and I let her, because some kinds of consequence matter more than others, and keeping my children's lives free of this man mattered more to me than watching him face additional legal exposure for what he'd done to his own mother. I flew back to Seattle in December to formally complete the verification process at Walter Hines' office. It took most of a day: identity confirmation, notarized documentation of my marriage to James, a legal affidavit regarding the circumstances of the fire on Lookout Mountain Road that Walter had painstakingly assembled from Eleanor's own written account, preserved among her private papers. Reading Eleanor's words for the first time, in her own careful, slanted handwriting, describing the night a stranger in a paramedic's uniform had carried her out of smoke and heat and set her down gently on wet grass, staying with her until the fire crew arrived, even though he had another call waiting, was the closest I ever came to actually meeting her. There was one more page in that folder, one that Walter set aside and handed to me separately, almost hesitantly, near the end of the appointment. It was a short letter, dated just 6 weeks before Eleanor's death, addressed to me by name, though we had never once spoken. "Dear Claire," it read, "I never found the right way to reach out to you while I was alive, and I've spent more time than I'd like to admit regretting that. Your husband gave me 20 more years I never expected to have, and I have tried, in my own quiet way, to make sure that gift echoed forward into your family's life the way it echoed into mine. I hope you'll forgive an old woman for taking so long to say thank you properly, and I hope, more than anything, that you and your children will use what I'm leaving behind to build the kind of life James would have wanted for you. Not a life defined by the money, but a life made freer because of it. With more gratitude than I ever managed to say out loud, Eleanor." I read that letter 3 times in Walter's office, and then folded it carefully and put it in my bag, and I have kept it in the drawer of my nightstand ever since, in almost exactly the spot where James used to keep his unexplained envelopes. I told Owen and Maya the truth that same week, sitting them down at the kitchen table the way James and I used to do for family meetings back when the biggest news we ever had to deliver was a move to a new school district. Owen, 15 by then and already halfway toward the version of himself he'd grow into, went very quiet for a long moment and then asked, in a voice that cracked slightly in the middle, whether that meant Dad had really run into a burning building. I told him yes. He nodded slowly, the way you nod when a piece of a puzzle you've been carrying around unfinished for years finally clicks into place, and said, "That sounds like him." Maya, 12 by then, wanted to know if Eleanor had a dog, and whether we could visit wherever she used to live, and I told her I didn't know about the dog, but that yes, someday we absolutely would. It wasn't a dramatic conversation. There were no tears, not that night. It felt instead like watching both of my children quietly absorb one more true thing about a father most of them barely remembered, folding it gently into the collection of stories they were slowly building to explain him to themselves. The first distribution from the trust cleared in January, a little over 10 years and 3 months after James died. I was standing in my kitchen, almost exactly where I'd been standing when Walter first called, when the notification came through on my phone. I sat down on the same patch of tile floor, and this time I let myself cry without trying to explain it to myself at all. I want to tell you honestly what changed and what didn't, because I think that matters more than the number itself. We moved, eventually, to a house with a real yard in Golden, not far, as it happens, from Lookout Mountain Road, though I didn't choose the location for that reason. I chose it because Owen had gotten into a magnet science program nearby, one that has since helped push him firmly toward the emergency medicine career he still says, unprompted, that he wants. Maya still keeps James's photograph on her nightstand, though these days it sits beside a photograph of Eleanor as well, a woman she never met but has decided, in the particular generous way children sometimes settle these things for themselves, to think of as a kind of guardian angel. I still work, though these days it's part-time, consulting for the same hospital network supply chain division, because I discovered, somewhat to my own surprise, that I actually love the work itself and wasn't only doing it out of necessity. I set up a modest scholarship fund through Golden's Fire and EMS department in James's name for paramedics pursuing further emergency medicine training because it felt like the truest way to honor the part of him I only fully understood after he was gone. Ray Delgado, the fire captain who remembered that night on Lookout Mountain Road, was the first person I called when the fund was finalized. He cried on the phone, which surprised us both, and he sat on the small selection committee every year since. Priya still shows up unannounced most Sunday evenings, wine for herself and sparkling water for me, though these days our conversations are less about survival and more about ordinary things. Maya's driving lessons, Owen's college applications, whether either of our knees will survive another attempt at the hiking trail where James proposed, which I finally worked up the courage to walk again 3 years after his death, Owen's small hand in mine the whole way up. Doug Marino, James's old partner, still comes for Thanksgiving every year and still tells the same 3 stories about James that he told at the funeral, and we still laugh every single time as though we're hearing them for the first time, because some grief, I've learned, softens eventually into something closer to warmth. I think about Eleanor Voss often, a woman I never met who quietly reshaped my family's entire future out of a debt she felt she could never fully repay. I think about James constantly, of course, but differently now, not only as the tired, gentle man who fell asleep next to me for 9 years, but as the 26-year-old paramedic who ran into a burning house without a second thought because it was simply, unhesitatingly, who he was. I used to think I knew everything important about my husband. I understand now that some of the truest things about the people we love are the ones they never think to mention, because to them, kindness at large doesn't feel like a story worth telling. It just feels like Tuesday. If this story taught me anything, it's that the people who love us best are often carrying more than we ever get to see, and that the debts of gratitude the world owes quiet, ordinary heroes have a way of finding their way home eventually, even years after that hero is gone. Nathaniel Voss counted on my exhaustion and my fear to make me sign away what was rightfully my children's. He was wrong, the same way people like him are so often wrong, because he mistook a grieving widow's tiredness for weakness, when really it was simply the quiet before someone finally had the strength to fight. What would you have done, sitting on that kitchen floor, hearing a stranger tell you your husband had been a hero all along? Tell me in the comments. I'd genuinely love to know. And if this story moved you even a little, please share it with someone who needs a reminder today that kindness, even the quiet, unspoken kind, always finds its way back around. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.